Welcome everybody to our animals time of the year. We are starting our animals section off strong with our invertebrates. And I want to remind everyone what the word invertebrate means. It means that this animal does not have a backbone. And so if you take your hand and you place it in the center of your back, you're going to feel your spine. Well, invertebrates don't have this spine or a backbone running down their back. They just don't have it. That's why they are an invertebrate. What's kind of crazy is about 95 to 99% of all animals are invertebrates. When we think of invertebrates, we tend to think of the soft bodies, worms and slugs, the animals that have external skeletons like crabs with their shells and insects with their crunchy bodies, even shrimp. Our first group is something that you might not have even known was an animal. We are going to work through all the different groups of animals. And if we think back to our classification unit, we start off with the domain, and we are going to be in the domain Eukarya, in the kingdom Animalia, and in the phylum Porifera, which means sponges. These aquatic animals are in fact animals, guys. It's so crazy. So we're going to work through a couple notes together about these sponges. So sponges, first of all, have what's called asymmetry, meaning there's no way that you can cut them in half that they will be identical on both sides. Their organization is just cells. They don't have tissues. They just don't. They are only cells. And I want to talk about their structure because when we look at sponges, we just kind of see this thing underwater. And there's so much more to them that you don't even know is there. First of all, they are sessile, meaning that they're stationary. They're going to attach themselves to surfaces, and where they are is where they stay. Now, looking at a sponge, our first structure we want to label is the pore. And the pore allows water to flow into the sponge. It's kind of like the little holes on your skin that allow the oils to come out of your face. The pores on a sponge are little holes that allow water to go into the sponge. Next up, we have the spongiocele. The spongiocele is that hollow body cavity on the inside or in the middle. That spongiocele is where all the water is held after it comes into the pore. To get into the pore, it has to go through the collar cells. And these collar cells have flagella. We learned about them in our protist unit. The flagella are those whip-like tails, and they're going to move the water through the sponge from the pore into the spongiocele, through the spongiocele, and then eventually out the top or out the osculum. This osculum is that large opening on the top of the sponge that the water actually exits or flows out of. Our last structure to label are the spikes. These spikes support and protect the sponge and kind of act like a structure or a skeleton that holds them up. Okay? So I do have a quick video for you showing you how water moves through the sponge.
Hefty barrel sponge. What will a big monster like this do? It takes a few seconds for the dye to work its way through the sponge. Wait for it. But then it pours out like smoke from a chimney. That's pretty good pumping from those tiny little collar cells.
So you can see how we can prove that sponges take in water from their surroundings and pump it out their osculum by pouring that dye around it and watching the dye move through the sponge. Sponges don't have any systems. They don't have a digestive system. They don't have a circulatory system. They just filter the water and pull out their food source. Speaking of food source, let's talk about how they eat. Sponges are called filter feeders because what they do is they filter the water and they eat the plankton through it. And by that, what I mean is the water enters through the pore and it brings all of the plankton, it brings in the oxygen, it brings in everything they need. It goes through the cells and the cells pull out anything they need, like their food source, like the oxygen from the water. And then anything that is left over goes into the spongiocele and out the osculum. So here's a nice little GIF showing how this happens. Starting on the left from outside in the ocean, the water goes in, it's moved by the flagella, food is absorbed, and then it leaves the collar cells and into the spongiocele, out the osculum. Here's a zoom in close-up of the collar cell. You can see how they have the flagella. They have a collar. That's why they're called a collar cell. And you can see the food going into the cell being engulfed by a food vacuole, just like our other cells. Sponges do reproduce. Sponges have two ways they can reproduce. They can reproduce asexually, meaning they don't need two different sets of chromosomes in order to make a new sponge. They do this through mitosis, that's the splitting of cells that we learned about. This process is called budding. So one sponge, you can see that tall center sponge, is going to make a bud or a smaller sponge off to the side of it. And that smaller sponge is going to grow, and then when it's matured enough to survive, it's going to fall off the adult sponge, and wherever it lands in the ocean, it's going to attach and become its own new sponge. Sponges also reproduce sexually by sperm and egg. Now they do what we call external fertilization, meaning the sperm and the egg meet up outside of the organism. In sponges, this means that the sperm and the egg are released out the osculum into the water, and the sponges are hoping that the sperm from one sponge meets with the egg from another sponge, and that will fall to the ocean floor and create a new sponge. So I have a couple videos showing that. All right, and I have one more video about sponge reproduction.
We had just an amazing day today. Barrel sponges were spawning, and it only happens once a year. You can see the female eggs coming out of the female barrel sponge. Their consistency like bread, wet bread, just little chunks of eggs floating on the reef, coming out just like a volcano. You can see this one barrel sponge. There's a little coney that goes right inside. Watch, it goes right in there. They're not eating the eggs. I didn't see any fish eating them, but it seems he was curious. the male barrel sponge produces the sperm. And it looks identical to like a smoke pot. And the whole reef is smoking like this. The smoke pots, it looks like it's smoldering like a forest fire. For as long as our dive lasted, we swam in the smoky forest of coral. And after 4 or 5 years experiences, today's footage was the best as far as clarity of the water, and I was excited to finally get this in 4K. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
All right, and some fun facts about sponges. Sponges are actually food, so they are prey for snails, different types of fish, starfish, and even sea turtles. So let's take a minute and watch this super cute sea turtle eat some sponge. All right. So that's all I have for you about sponges. We will talk about more animals another time.